Morning, everybody. It's really great to be here. Thank you to Melissa and the SCT for the opportunity to be here. I was saying when I was speaking with Melissa this morning that when I was at BT&E, I used to sit in rooms like this and watch people give these talks. I always thought, I wonder what it would be like. And to have the opportunity to do that today is, for me, really exciting and kind of one of those career life moment tick boxes. So yeah, really, really good to be here. And I get to use this cool clicker, which is great. So I'll thank you for the introduction, very kind of you. And here we go. So to introduce myself, so yeah, Wales Manager is a very grand title. At Broadway Partners, I'm the Wales Manager is a community liaison role. So I work with communities, work on engaging communities to see where there is interest in better connectivity. I have a counterpart that does the build side of it. We have a Wales project manager, a lady called Jane, who used to work for OpenReach, so we very much work as a team in doing that. Broadway Partners, so we're an altnet in the industry, so there's a few of us working in Wales, so you might have also heard of Oggy, Vineus, Beacons Telecom, fibre. They're all altnets that are working in and around the area that we are as well. So Broadway Partners was established in 2016. We started in wireless on the Isle of Arran and have since, in more recent years, particularly during COVID, moved towards fibre to the premises. So that's where our focus is now, and we're demand-led. So we go where communities want a better connection. So we're not kind of cherry-picking communities. We're very much going where the demand is and working with them on their projects. So up on the screen are just a few different photos, mainly of myself because I'm that vain, just in different community areas, working with different communities and doing different things. So, community broadband projects, so working with communities to improve rural connectivity with fibre to the premises. So that's exactly what we do. So we work with rural communities, so that's community councils, town councils, local authorities, growth deals, to bring fibre to the premises to the last 5%, the hardest to reach. We're not looking at market towns, though sometimes they do happen to be included in a project. We are looking at the ultra-rural area, your farms, your little villages, your rural hamlets. So we're working to connect all of those within our networks. We currently are working in Pembrokeshire, Powys, Ceredigion, Carmarthenshire and Monmouthshire in Wales. We also have network builds in Scotland that I mentioned, so Kinross, the Isle of Arran and a few other small networks, and that's where we very much started, but a large amount of our focus is now in Wales. Each local authority area mentioned there has a different kind of way of looking at digital connectivity. So, for example, Pembrokeshire has, the local authority in Pembrokeshire County Council, has 8 officers dedicated to improving fixed line connectivity in the county. So they've got a huge team of people that are working with suppliers like Broadway to basically improve connectivity across the county. And they have a really unique way of doing that. Pembrokeshire County Council, basically with their team, divided Pembrokeshire up into just over 80 lots. And they then did some demand stimulation to see which of those 80 lots were most interested in better connectivity. They then helped communities with their introduction to suppliers like Broadway, and the communities that were interested chose a supplier to work with on a community broadband project. And that has then kind of been copied on a smaller scale in Powys, Ceredigion and Carmarthenshire, where each local authority has one officer. And I was Powys County Council's community broadband officer, so I was responsible for getting these projects up and running within the local authority area. So most local authorities have adopted the Pembrokeshire model on a smaller scale, but kind of when inquiries come in and people say, I want better connectivity, you talk about how these projects get started, and away you go in essence. But there are certain criteria that each project has to kind of tick almost. So when you talk about a community broadband project, the first thing is managing expectations is absolutely key in all of that. These projects can take 2 years, slightly more, slightly less, depending on the challenges that are faced ahead. So when you first meet a community, the first thing is managing expectations correctly. And one of the first things you say is, if we're in this for the long haul, it's going to be roughly 2 years from now until, connections are potentially being made in properties. So, and to be fair, that doesn't put any communities off because they've waited. Some have been waiting 8 years, some have been waiting even longer for better connectivity. So 2 years is a drop in the ocean compared to the potential time ahead of them. So most communities 100% bought in on that. It's then forming a project group is the next step in doing that. So one person can't do this on their own for 2 years. It's about helping engage the community and things like that. And in doing that, you need a small group of people. So project groups we're working with, we've got some that are just made up of members of the community, some people that have lived there since they were born or lived there for 20 years or have retired to the area from BT or OpenReach in some cases. So we've got those kind of project groups. We've got other project groups where we've actually got members of the community or town councils involved. So the community council, we always make them aware, out of courtesy and respect, we make them aware of our plans for the area when we have those initial conversations, because it's the right thing to do. And sometimes they'll go, actually, that's really interesting. We'll nominate a representative to come sit in the meetings, and they can report back to us with how you're getting on. So we tend to find that those are our project groups. We do have, on a very rare occasion, a few project groups that are purely the community council. The community council have actually taken the ball and said, a lot of our constituents that we represent have said, we would like better connectivity. You know, we've learned about what these projects mean. We want to choose a supplier. They then choose a supplier, and they are the project group linking in with the community. So there's 3 different types of project groups that we work with. So really exciting, and we find that particularly across Pembrokeshire, Powys, Ceredigion and Carmarthenshire, the project groups exactly kind of fit those categories in different variants. Monmouthshire's slightly different because we're working with rural communities, but we're actually kind of starting from the base up there. So that's kind of the projects in a bit of a nutshell. So the funding, so there is funding that we utilise. So we use the UK Gigabit Voucher. So we're a registered supplier with the UK Gigabit Voucher scheme, which are currently in Wales is actually on pause while they run their procurement exercise. So some key eligibility. The properties have to fall into Ofcom Area 3. So it doesn't fall into an intervention area or planned supplier rollout. So if it's within an OpenReach planned build or Superfast Cymru 2 as it was, or previously Superfast Cymru, if they're within any of those, then they're not voucher eligible. And the property has to receive speeds of less than 100 megabits per second. So anything that hasn't got fibre to the premises basically falls into a gigabit voucher range. And then you get up to £1,500 per residential property and up to £3,500 per business property. So that's actually quite a decent bit of support. But what the voucher scheme lends to is scale. So we always tend to start with the community council boundary. You know, connecting 10 properties is, you know, on their own is not feasible in terms of unbundling an exchange, putting in a cabinet and running a fibre network into the middle of nowhere. We need to look at scale. We need to look at a sizable network. So we start with the community council boundary, and we look at the properties within that in terms of their speed categories. And things like that. So this is the UK Gigabit Voucher Scheme genuinely is game-changing. It has enabled projects in rural areas because they suddenly become more feasible because the spend isn't as high. The key thing I should note about the UK Gigabit Vouchers is you don't get paid until the end. You don't get paid until after connection. So the process with the vouchers, in essence, is that you put in a funding application for an area once you've got to a point with a community, gets approved by UK government, and we then don't get paid until each property is connected. And UK government check with every property, have you been connected before we pay Broadway the voucher? So we have to kind of go through a whole, which I'll talk about in a bit, a whole kind of demand stimulation. We measure the interest in an area, because when you're going to spend a huge amount of money building a fibre network in a rural area, you need to know that the customers are going to be there to want to be connected at the very end of it. So I'm going to talk about 2 communities in particular. One is an area that actually probably the reason that I'm here today is Aberedu. So I'm going to talk about Aberedu, and that there's a huge link between Aberedu and myself being here, and also Ambleston in Pembrokeshire. So Aberedu, I'm very personally attached to. I live 10 minutes from the project. It was one of my first projects that started when I was at Powys County Council. It's a real kind of privilege to be able to see that through now that I work at Broadway Partners, and also talk about Ambleston at Pembrokeshire, which is actually one of our first fibre builds that we're just completing now in Pembrokeshire. So to very briefly talk about the different dots and pins that you see on the map, you probably realise that those are properties, and the colours are their speed categorisation. So to work backwards, red and orange is superfast broadband and above. Then you've got yellow, which is between 11 and 30 megabits per second. Green is between 1 and 10. And then grey is speed unknown, which you probably already aware is quite common to find an unknown speed in a rural area. You can see there's quite a few grey pins in those areas, but we tend to find where there's grey pins, there's usually three categories. One is the building was demolished a long time ago and just still sits on a database somewhere. 2 is it's just got terrible speeds. Or 3, it's a monument of some sort, like a castle or something like that. So, but commonly it is a building, but it just doesn't have a speed category, and it tends to be horrendously slow. So when we start with these project areas, Broadway's commitment is to connect every single property that wants to be connected within that area. There are obviously going to be some challenges. Some of those, wayleaves was mentioned at the very end of the introduction and things like that. Wayleaves is definitely an issue and a challenge to some of those properties being connected, but we will try everything to do it, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a bit. So, community broadband scheme. So here's a bit of a roadmap in terms of how they start and where they go. So we start off with the community getting in touch. So they reach out to myself or via the website. I then have a conversation with that individual or group to kind of talk about Broadway, to talk about the project, to talk about the expectation management from the start. We then define the scope of the project, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a minute. We engage with the wider community. We submit a funding application once we know there's interest from the wider community. We survey the area once the funding's approved. We then do a high-level and low-level design based on the surveys, and then we build and connect our customers. So that's the roadmap. It's very simplified, but that's the roadmap we tend to share with the communities, because for a lot of people, as you're probably aware, broadband goes over people's heads. I don't need it. I speak to some people who are very proud to tell me they've never had the internet, don't want the internet, have a Doro flip phone. So it's about articulating what connectivity means to people in many ways, in trying to understand, in trying to find out who wants to be connected, and are they a genuine customer potentially or not. And COVID's definitely helped hugely in a lot of this. So to highlight, when I worked at Paris County Council, I met with a community. Was our first community broadband project, a community called Llanafn Vawr Llanwthel, which is always a bit of a mouthful for our team who are based up in Liverpool, that community, that community in essence, I met with them a bit later to say, how did COVID inhibit, how did it affect your project? And they said, actually, it enabled our project, which really kind of took me off guard. I was expecting them to go, it was really challenging. But what COVID did was allowed them to meet with Broadway and other suppliers virtually. They had access to our CEO in London. They had access to our team on the Wirral. All once a week on a Monday evening at 6 o'clock, they had access to all these people. So actually, COVID enabled a way of people connecting that allowed these projects to get started. And I found that when I worked at Paris County Council I left Paris County Council in December. Community meetings in person only really started this April-ish time. So every project before that point was all built and started virtually. The engagement was done. Zoom, for example, is a great, Zoom and Teams are both great because if you've got a terrible internet connection, you can dial in by phone. So you could have people join in by phone. Those are able to, sit there on a Zoom call and with their video off and just about manage a VoIP connection. It worked. So it enabled those conversations. It enabled the ability to engage communities because I'll talk about community meetings in a moment, but we used to do virtual community meetings and we used to have 40 people join virtually and a presentation be shared on the screen, and people would answer questions in the dark. And actually the feedback on that was people asked questions in those meetings that would never turn up to a community meeting in a village hall, that would never usually ask a question because they got to do it, via their telephone number, and no one knew who that person was. So the story was that they felt it enabled projects. And actually my experience at Paris County Council is it enabled me to speak with people. Powys, if you're not aware of the county, is the largest county in Wales. It's got a ridiculous percentage of the land mass, but almost one of the smallest percentages of the population. It's absolutely vast. Every county in Wales is linked via Powys. It's almost the bridge to the rest of the country. So I was speaking with people that are 2 hours to the north of me or an hour and a half to the south of me, starting projects without having to leave my wife's dressing table, which has now become my desk for the last 2 years. So all her makeup's been pushed to one side. So I could set stuff up in an evening with communities, and it's still work, still enable and work perfectly. And don't get me wrong, it's evolved since COVID ended. That lots more people now want to meet in person, and that's the way that it is. Communities want to do that, so we've adapted to that way. Anyway, I keep going off on tangents, so I apologise. So to define the scope, so I'm going to try the little pointer here. I'll see if look at that. So, that's very cool. So the screen image you see on the left-hand side is the community council boundary of Aberedu. That is the community council boundary as defined by the Welsh government. When we first met with Aberedu, we discussed the scope. Are there any areas that you feel, do we need to bring it in? Do we need to move it out? What do we want to do? So what you can see on the right-hand side is the final scope, and you can see that we've extended little bits. So I'm going to try pointing at the screen here. So you can see the difference between that little hump there and it disappearing there. So the feedback from the community was, in essence, there's no properties up there. So you need to descope that large amount of landmass. There are no properties up there, no one lives there. Take that section out and discount the landmass from the build. So we did exactly that. They then mentioned the areas of Cregina and Glascombe, which are the two areas up here. Once again, two very rural areas. Glascombe's a great example because actually it's showing as grey. We know that those are all actually properties, but their speed is awful. They're either relying on an average satellite connection or what 4G can be picked up in the area. So most of them aren't using their fixed line, other than those that don't want broadband and are still using it just for their landline. So they wanted to bring those two areas into the project. So we did just that, working with them virtually on a screen. I wasn't at Broadway at the time, I was at Powys County Council. Our CEO and his techie lady called Beth, they worked to redraw that line with them on the screen to bring in those properties. So it was a really nice way of working with the community. They're defining their scope, and they're also defining where they feel that they can reach. Because if we're saying, for example, that we need 30% of properties to register their interest to signal a potentially viable customer base for us to progress a project towards funding application, survey and build, i.e. committing a large amount of resource, we need to, in bringing that in, if they can't engage that area, then potentially actually it makes the project less viable, but they're confident. They've got friends up there. They know the community. Gareth Jones, who's the county councillor for that area now, knows everybody. He knows everybody. You talk about somebody, and he's like, I know them. They live up this road here, or they live down in the caravan over there. So he really helped in terms of guiding where the best reach of, A, the community council was, but where the project group could reach as well. So we brought them in. So Cregina and Glascombe are part of the project, they're part of the funding application, they're part of the funding approval. And it's lovely to be able to talk about this because the community have been really considerate. It would have been very easy to go, Aberystwyth's fine. We're the community council. Gareth was the clerk for the community council time. He could have very easily said, we'll stick to the community council area because that's our reach. But they thought about a bigger scale. They thought about the wider community, and they created this. So really, really exciting. And I should mention here as well that Powys County Council have, under their rural development plan and their rural development team, also helped fund the start of this project in terms of the planning, and they're actually capturing a load of case studies from Aberystwyth and also another project called Dwyrum and Avon, which actually followed a very similar line to this one. So engaging the community. So one of the biggest perks of working with the community is they already have established channels that we can utilise to get information out on. So the first thing we do is we do a direct mail. So once we've kind of got the project group, we define the scope. The scope defines our mailing list because we can pull up all the properties on there. We do a direct mail, but the direct mail isn't one of our Broadway direct mails with all of our branding on it. It's written by the community. So the community write that direct mail. We'll obviously advise about the funding and things like that and fact check it, but we will then print it and post it to every single property in that area. So it's a personalised letter. If the community council want to, we let them put their, the chair of the community council's name on it. If they want to put their name on it, no pressure. So, for example, the letter in Aberystwyth had the chair of the community council's name on it. It had the clerk of the community council's name on it, had the county council's name on it as well, a lady called Maureen Mackenzie, who's since moved on from the council. They all put their names on that letter, no pressure, but they had the opportunity to do that, and as the letter was being shaped by them, they did that. So what that enabled us to do was almost to validate what was coming out, because if it just came from Broadway, as most of us do, a bit of junk mail comes through the post and the recycling bin usually has it straight away. It actually meant that people read it because it said from your local community, and when you opened it, it was all written, the terminology, the references were all community references and terminology. The signatures were community people that people know well. So automatically it meant that people read the letter, and in the letter we encourage people just to register their interest. There's no commitment by doing that. You're not signing a contract. It's just putting your hand up and saying, I'm interested, which helps us kind of gauge, is there the interest for us to commit resource and time and effort and money to this build? And they don't. When we look at kind of a rough 30% figure, dependent on the area, and Abredu absolutely smashed through that. It's about 47% of the properties in the area have registered their interest. So that really does say it all. Abredu does have a village with fibre to the cabinet, which is the red bit you saw on the previous slide. But mostly it's rural. So what we've worked out is actually a good number of the village has also registered their interest and wanted to be part of it. We use Facebook, but not our Facebook so much. The community have established channels, established Facebook pages, community Facebook pages for the village hall and things like that. They post information on those channels. They have websites, so they also post things on there. We provide banners if they want them. There's some good pictures of one of our banners there, so we'll provide banners and things like that for if they want to do that and to put them up. The nice thing about working with communities is they can ask, the local farmer, could you put it on your gate and things like that. So actually we're gaining permission to put these things in places, and the community are arranging all of that. We don't have to give them banners. We offer it to them. We offer the trailer. The trailer is there on the top left. I know I've pointed and I feel bad for the video people. I will highlight it now just so it's there. There's the trailer. That's in Glascombe actually. So that's in just north of the project as it is. We provide posters, we put bits in local newsletters, and we do community meetings. So community meetings we find very beneficial because, I do the community meetings, and in essence it's a 10-minute presentation because people don't want death by PowerPoint. And then we do a long Q&A because that's where we tend to get the most benefit, because people want to ask questions. They want to understand connectivity, broadband, what it means for them, the challenges, potentially failings of previous companies as well. What are the learnings from that? Are we going down the same road again? So that is, those are very beneficial in terms of getting the word out. And they have direct access to me. So it's not, they don't have to go online and go for a chat bot. They always have direct access to me, and I pride myself on my service level, same day response on an email if it's within the working day. I'll always call people back if I don't answer my phone, except for Melissa this morning when I was driving. Sorry. So they always have access to me. So they've got access to a human being that will acknowledge and respond timely. So if I've got bad news to share, it's better. I always think it's better to share it quickly than leave it 5 days and then share it, because people then get frustrated that they've waited for something they don't want to hear. So I always pride myself in that kind of service level. And I think that's important to be put. It's an EE line, personal and local. I really do believe in that, in being personal and local and treating people with that respect. So we work through all of this, and all this is about demand stimulation. And it's not about anybody signing a contract. It's just about registrations of interest, people putting their hand up and saying, I'm interested if you were to build this network. So the key thing, before I mention surveys, is we do the funding application. So we hit our kind of marker that signals viability. We put a funding application into UK government under the Gigabit Voucher Scheme, and then they'll either decline, approve it. That process, depending on the community, is taken anywhere from a week up to 8 months. So it can be a fairly lengthy piece of time. And the key thing is managing community expectation as we go, keeping people up to date. So when people register interest, they register their interest with their email address. And so we just send them an email, say the funding application's gone in, this may take some time, so it might be a while before you hear from us. But that goes from me, so people have direct access to me again, they can get back in touch with me. Any questions about contracts coming to an end, renewals, things like that, I can answer those questions as well. So to talk about the surveys, so we do 3 surveys. So we're looking for the site of our cabinet or mini exchange, as I explained it to the community. So we look for a site for our mini exchange. We do the overhead pole survey, so we have PIA, we have a physical infrastructure agreement with Openreach, so we can use all of their poles and ducts. So we survey every single pole within an area, and we survey all the ducts as well, so do test rod and rope on all the ducts. Basically, we just want to know what we're going into, because we won't put our fibre on wonky poles. Particularly, you'll find in rural areas, I go walking a lot, living in them, you'll find that when you go outside of a slightly built-up area, the poles start hanging in the trees, and the trees start becoming the poles more than the poles are. So we're surveying all of those, so we know what needs to be replaced before we run our fibre. We know where the trees need to be cut back from the line. We know where we've got duct collapses or blockages and things like that. So it allows us to plan the infrastructure before we go in and then run our fibre. So we kind of get a better idea of what we're going into. And the kind of things we find, obviously, are rotten poles or deep poles. We find poles missing where they should be. We find poles where there shouldn't be poles. So, for example, we did a survey in Llanafan Valley at the start of the year. We were looking for just over 1,800 telegraph poles. We came out with just over 2,100. So it just shows the inaccuracy. Some people say, well, why don't you just use the information that's available to you? And that is exactly the reason, is we actually want to know what's there, what's not, so we can plan accurately what we're doing. And same with ducting as well. You know, the duct collapses are a big thing because duct collapses tend to lead to road closures and things like that. So we need to know what traffic management we're planning ahead and things like that. Cabinet site, we obviously try and put that considerately. We tend to try and go next to the open reach cabinets because it tends to have all the right things in place, but not always does that suit where we're looking to go. So sometimes we'll find a different location for the cabinet and put in the orders to open reach for the backhaul. And there, yeah, so that's our main surveys, and that will then feed into our design. So this is Ambleston. So this is the second project I spoke about earlier. So this is the one, this is the project in Pembrokeshire. So the key thing is actually we've just finished building this area. And you can see once again, you've got the fibre to the cabinet here. And then you've got the wider area is the rural area where you've got really poor connectivity. One of the key things about the voucher scheme is those that have got fibre to the cabinet, as I mentioned before, are voucher eligible. So they're voucher eligible. And the nice thing about the gigabit voucher scheme is the money is, it's not just like £1,500 per residential property. If a property, for example, in the area with the red infrastructure, so if a property within there, it's not going to cost £1,500 per residential property to build. It's not. The infrastructure is going to be better because they've built fibre to the cabinet. So in doing that, the infrastructure would have had a bit of an overhaul in that area. So it's not going to cost £1,500 per residential property there, and definitely not £3,500 per business. But the money from the pot, in terms of the funding approval, can be reallocated to the more challenging properties. So you could redistribute some of that money from the Wallace area that you see there into areas like Tufton that are further out, that are more challenging. So you can redistribute that money in the pot to connect those more challenging properties, which is why it's a bit of a game changer. But the key thing is getting those that have fibre to the cabinet interested, because most people will go, well, I've got the most common misconception is, and probably the second most common question I get, other than timescales, is, well, I've got superfast fibre. Well, I've got superfast fibre, I've already got fibre. And then you've got to go through, well, actually, that's fibre to the cabinet, this is fibre to the premises. You know, you talk about the capability of fibre to the premises, the fact that fibre to the cabinet potentially has a shelf life of the next decade based on our data usage and the way the industry's going and our wanting to work from home and our digital lives are changing and evolving. So you have to go through a lot of explanations with those that have got fibre to the cabinet. I do genuinely believe that super fast fibre is actually, I never thought about it when I worked at EE and BT and I was doing this in retail, actually is a slightly misleading in terms of its title, because it makes people think, oh, I've got fibre into my property. It's like, well, no, you've got the old copper line and the fibre's, you know, a mile down the road with that green cabinet in the village that you've seen. So it is a harder nut to crack, but when people understand it, they come on board. And the other one is when you've got really tight communities like Ambleston, is when you actually say to them, but it's for the community, you know, it's for your community. Someone did a really nice Facebook post, actually in one of our Ceredigion projects. She was really well thought of in the community. She basically said, I've already got fibre to the premises, but by me signing up to this scheme, this is going to help enable my neighbours that aren't as fortunate as me. And our registrations of interest shot through the roof because just her articulating it in that way as a member of the community made such a huge difference to their understanding and perception of the project. So it is just trying to get people to understand what this means, not just for them, but for their neighbours, their friends, their family that live in the area as well. So I'm now going to move on to what the design of the network actually looked like. So there's the design of the network as you see it on screen. So it is zoomed out, so it is all a bit clustered, but you can see the purple and everything is poles. You can see the orange is the duct network. And I want to talk specifically about this group here. So we've connected the whole area. We've stuck to our commitment. There are about 12 properties. They are genuinely the hardest to reach. That doesn't mean that they're at the end of the track, but we have had some challenges. So I'm going to talk about the two properties that I just circled. So that was the original design to connect them, which required four-way leaves. Four-way leaves, which we've really, really struggled to get hold of. We've really struggled to get the agreements from the four landowners, despite the run not being that long, to connect those two properties. But what I love about Broadway is we haven't given up. We haven't gone, oh, I can't get four-way leaves. We'll have to just, we'll have to look at a wireless option for those properties. We've gone back to the drawing board. And actually, with myself liaising with the two property owners, Rupert and John, we've actually found a completely different route. It's going to require 1,000 metres of extra running of infrastructure. But what we've found is, if I highlight this again, so to the left-hand side is the furthest property on its own, so that kind of purple property highlighted there. Well, the gentleman that owns that property, Rupert, has said, well, actually, I've got a very thin driveway. Could you get the infrastructure down the driveway? I own the driveway, and I own half the hedge on the other side. I drive a stand-up people carrier, and I bottomed out trying to get down his driveway to meet him. So I had to park my car on the road and walk the 500 metres to his property, down the wettest pothole track I've ever walked down, to meet Rupert, and actually to meet John as well. And Rupert said, well, if you can get this down my driveway, which I own, it's only one landowner between me and John, which is about 580 metres across the field. So he's basically saying, rather than coming from the right-hand side, come from the left and work your way across. And that's what we've done. So he introduced us to the landowner, Mr. Davis. We met Mr. Davis on site, and with Rupert and John were able to articulate what this meant for them, the importance of this for them personally, and what it means for their lives, their ability to connect with their family. And he agreed to the wayleave on site. He agreed to the wayleave there and then. And so one of the big perks of these projects is that we actually can have the community can help, A, through their connection, and B, just for articulating that we're not just a company that wants to cross the land. Actually, we're doing something incredibly challenging to reach people that, unless we do it, it could be a good few years before somebody else comes along and does it. So, a real big success and evidence that we don't cherry pick and we don't give up like a dog with a bone. We just keep going. And that's not me, that's Jane, our project manager for Wales. She is really focused on delivering on our promises, and that's a great example. So they're actually due to be connected in the coming weeks. So just wanted to highlight that example. But the design, if I go back for a second, and you look at the different colours and the different spurs, I've tried to overline it perfectly. The design genuinely brings all of those into consideration. We're not missing anybody out. There's obviously challenges with the funding, is that we can't justify going, say if you had a lane and there's 4 properties at the end, but none of them want to be connected. We can't justify spending government money to build up that road. We can't justify spending our own money to build up that road where no one wants a connection. So what we do say to people is, if you want to be connected by the project, it's best to do it before we move on, because when we come back, the funding's gone, and we're going to have to talk about the cost of running 150 metres up there to get to yourselves. So our encouragement is, for if you do want to be connected, do it while we're there. Don't do it after we've left and after the funding's expired. So yes, another thing about the design, and particularly as we're scaling up, is we're thinking about our other projects. So what we find with these projects is they ripple effect from community to community. So Aberedu, the project I showed you earlier, there's now a project to the south in Paynes Castle. There's a project to the north that picks up the other half of the community council area that it's moved into, which is the Glascombe Community Council area. So suddenly you've got projects to the north and south. Same with this one. We've got Puncheston to the north, and we've got Wolf's Castle to the left, both of which have chosen Broadway. So actually, this network's going to feed part of Puncheston. So Puncheston is to the wrong clicker. Is to the north up here. So we're actually going to be running our infrastructure. You can just about see the road on there. We'll be running our infrastructure from Ambleston all the way up into Puncheston. So actually we're thinking about the bigger picture, where our networks will feed next in terms of our future projects. So, and the same with Aberedu. So we're talking about running fibre all the way round to get to an area, because there's 1,100 metres of missing infrastructure. So actually it's easier to run it the long way round, because actually it's going to cut through one of our own projects anyway. So why not run it round? Because it's going to benefit a future project at the same time. So to talk about the build. So this is probably the most exciting moment, and it's the biggest lead-in time. Some of these projects is 18 months of talking, talking about what's going to come, how it's going to happen, and then it actually happens in the last kind of 6 months of that 2-year process, and it happens rapidly. When we start building, we build. We put all of our resource into that area to focus on completing that build, so people see everything happening at once. The cabinet tends to go in beforehand, because there's usually an SLA to get the backhaul in from OpenReach, so to negate that, we tend to put the cabinet in earlier. But then we're talking about replacing poles, or where we can't get them replaced, putting in poles next to poles, putting in new ducts, unblocking ducts, mole ploughing across fields, running miles of fibre. Our Llanafan project in mid Wales, which basically runs, it's about 5 to 6 miles north to south, and then about 4 miles east to west. We're going to run over 100 kilometres of fibre within that rural area. So it's the scale of the fibre run is crazy, because you've got all the rabbit warrens of that you're running your fibre down different roads to different farms and to different groups of property. So we start the build, and we do use sub and prime contractors as well as our own resource. And we treat them as part of the Broadway family. They are part of us, what we do, and we treat them like they were a member of our own internal team. So it's lovely to have that relationship with our contractors. And I was saying earlier, I was driving out of a community meeting a few weeks ago. It was about 9 o'clock at night, and I drove down the road, and the splicers were there, splicing fibre in the evening. And it was just so nice to see that dedication and want and commitment to connect that community by running by working so late to get things done. We're working on weekends, we're working ridiculous hours so that we don't interfere with roads, particularly when you're working on a single track rural road. The last thing you want to do, particularly in the summer when farms are trying to run down it, is close the road. So we'll tend to work in the night, do that work in the night so it doesn't interfere with the road during the day. So really trying to work not just with the community and for the community, but with the local authorities. We have a really close working relationship, partly because they all have a broadband officer, but with the highways team, so in Pembrokeshire County Council, got a really close working relationship with the highways team. They're really good at letting us know if there's resurfacing work coming in 2 years' time, so they know where our future projects are. We're open and honest with them, and they go, well, actually, we've got large-scale resurfacing works happening in this area, at this time. Do you want, because there's usually a 2-year embargo on digging up the road then to put something in. Do you want to put this in early because it's going to be open? So we'll actually work with them on that kind of planning, but also on things like embargoes. Pembrokeshire is a beautiful county, has some really beautiful areas, and for that reason, during the summer months when tourists are in, we hit embargoes. We got a place called St Ishmael's, which we weren't able to connect during the summer because the embargo meant that we couldn't do any road working there at all, no civils work. So we've had to wait for the embargo to be over to then go back in and have a look at running the build. So we very much work with them on a very open and honest basis to make sure that we can A, plan properly, but B, involve them in what we're doing and be open and honest and transparent in the way that we're running that build. And it's really helped us to build efficiently and properly and to be able to plan properly using their knowledge and their relationship with us. And they're not just good at building relationships with us, they have the same relationships with Oggy and Vineas and things like that, and they impart that knowledge and that ability to do that. And Pembrokeshire County Council really is kind of it's the golden county in Wales, and all the other counties kind of look to them for inspiration and to learn from what they're doing, because what they've done is had a huge impact. They've got huge amounts of projects across the county, and they've stimulated the demand, they've checked the demand, and then kind of divided them up into priority based on that, and then help the communities be introduced to suppliers, to pick a supplier to then work with. Before I move on to a Q&A, I just briefly want to talk about just some of the challenges that we encountered over the last 3 years. And I know I've only been here since January, but you hear about them. We've taken a lot of learnings, and some of the things that we really struggled with initially was managing expectations right, which is why I talk about the 2-year timescale, is getting the expectation management set on. And it's probably one of the biggest things that we'll hold our hands up and say, we underestimated some of the rural challenge, and now we've completed some of these projects. The learnings that we've been able to apply to our new projects are amazing, but there are challenges. There are some wayleaves that we can't get exactly the right point. There are some wayleaves that are just, the landowners just won't agree. For some of the great examples, which are things like neighbour feuds and things like that, and people, and you'll speak to people on the phone and they'll go, oh, it's because of this person, isn't it? And you can't really confirm it, but they know that we need to cross that piece of land to get there. So that is an impact. There was briefly a shortage of telegraph poles. We had issues trying to get hold of telegraph poles. There's an issue with CBTs at the moment, CBT stock, which I'm sure you all know what it is, but they're the pieces that basically break the fibre to run into the property. There's a shortage of those, so that's an ongoing thing. We are stocked up, but we're aware that we need to really plan ahead in terms of bringing those in. So there are challenges that COVID have brought and things like that, but it's also enabled us to adapt to meet communities in new ways and allowed projects to continue to grow and expand and to build a network of projects across multiple counties. So yeah, there have been some challenges. The key one, the biggest question I get is, what's your timescales? When am I going to get connected? And actually, it's the hardest question to answer, because you don't want to give people false expectation and say it'll be 2 months, when actually it's going to be 6 months, and we don't actually know what the state of the infrastructure is between them and their property, and we don't know how the land agreement's going to go. So we try and be very open and honest with different properties in terms of the challenges that we might face. But if we can under-promise and over-deliver, that is exactly the way forward for us, and that's what we try to do, is kind of under-promise, over-deliver, and bring things forward where we can. But I've rambled on for ages, so I'm going to be quiet and move on to questions and answers. I don't know if I've kind of stuck-ish to time, so thank you very much anyway.
Well done, Reece. Q&A. Now's the exciting part. This is where we get to ask you all the questions.
Oh, here we go.
I've actually got one. Which technology are you using?
Fibre to the premises. So
what technology? PON?
The honest answer is I don't actually know the detail of that. I'll hold my hand up and say that my techie knowledge is ropey as I go along. So I'm not sure.
It's just to set the tempo for some of the others here. So be careful with technical questions.
Thank you. When am I going to be connected?
So, genuinely to answer that question, so the cabinet for Abredo is due to go in this month, and the build will then follow out this year. So, yes. This is the reason the Abredo project. So this is the reason I'm here.
Yes, my little pig was near
Yes.
my little pig was near on the Abredo map.
Yes. Yeah. So that's one of the ones where so there's a valley. So between the village and Crogina, there's a thing called the Edu Valley. And the Edu Valley, we drove it last week with our new head of build, a gentleman called Pete Buckle. And there's 1,100 metres of missing infrastructure in this valley. And we're trying to work out whether the best way is to run around by 100 House. So I know that name will be meaningful to you. And so we've got to run around via a place called 100 House. Because we actually drove the valley to see if we could maybe mole plough it or put poles up, but there's sheer rock faces along the Edu Valley, so we've realised that actually, visually, on seeing that, there's not a chance. We need to go the long way around via 100 House to do it, so yeah, very interesting.
I can only say thank you as well, because it's going to make it easier for me to have meetings with Roger. So the quicker this gets up and running, it's very important for me as well now. So, and it's on camera, so good luck.
Hiya. So, just with the voucher scheme, and you saying you have to connect people before you can claim the money.
Yeah.
So if someone's fixed in with Sky for 18 months, for example, and they go, no, we're on copper, but we don't want to pay a penalty to come out of it to join your network. How does that work?
So, because we give the 2-year time scale, we say to people, when your contract comes up for renewal, just to get in touch, because we'll have that conversation with them and we can advise. So if we think that we're 12 months away, we'll say if you're able to renew on a 12-month contract. So we try to advise on that length. There are times when we come to build that people are their contract might have 5 months left or something like that. So what we'll try and do when we have the conversation, we can connect you, and they'll go, well, I've got 3 months left of my contract. We'll say, well, actually, we've still got lots of build to do, so we'll keep building, and we'll come back to you in the last 30 days of your contract. So we're quite agile in the way that we can allocate our resource to do that. And in some cases, we'll buy people out of their contracts just to try and match that, but that's more rare. We tend to be able to plan the end of their contract with the start of ours. But a really good challenge out of that is the ecosystem thing, when people go, well, I'm with BT, but what happens to my BT Sports when I leave my contract? And one of the biggest challenges is overcoming ecosystems when people have got this, they've got their broadband, their TV, their mobile, their BT Sport package as an example. And very honest conversation is, you need to go back and ask them what the impact is, but every time the impact is you take one piece out and the other piece shoots up in price. So it's a very interesting hurdle that we're trying to overcome. So we've introduced things like we've partnered with Nokia. We use the Nokia Beacon 2 as our router now. We've just literally introduced it, and that enables a mesh network. So we're trying to find our own kind of niche in there in terms of what we can provide to help people, particularly in Wales. You've got old Welsh longhouses, farmhouses with thick walls and things like that. So our mesh network is to help that kind, try and build some perks up in terms of not just the price. So yeah, that's what we're trying to do. I've gone off on one again.
Reece, how many fibres do you run to residential properties? Is it 1, 2?
So to each individual property, it's one fibre, but it depends. Some properties will say, well, I've got a business garage as an example. I've got a business in my garage. Can I have a line? So we'll run a second fibre to that property. So sometimes, mainly it's one, but occasionally, depending on the layout. So for example, we have farms that want CCTV system. I've got a CCTV system on the other side. There's no way the Wi-Fi will reach it. So we'll work with them to create a solution that will allow them to connect their barns and connect their property, which usually creates a couple of fibres. The ones where we have the most fibres going in tends to be caravan parks, where sometimes we can do a solution where it's fibre to the point and then they'll put it out wirelessly. But we've got a few caravan parks where they'll go, no, while you're here, just connect every single one. And so we have had some with like caravan parks where we've connected every single one and gone that way around.
Are you using electricity poles? Are you using electricity?
We can use
poles?
Western Power low voltage poles, and same with the other
Yeah.
power supply. We haven't tended to. We tend to do it where we need joint usage poles, like in St Ishmael's, which I referenced earlier, where you've got electricity, lighting, and telecoms all on the same pole. So we do, but only where it needs to be joint usage almost.
Yeah, I see. Right. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Hello.
Hello. I'm interested in the business model you've got going here. Obviously, you're spending a lot of money putting all this kit in. Are
Yeah.
you really relying only on the gigabit voucher scheme, or do you have a lot of investors in the back?
So we have investors. So our investors are a company called Investors are Downing. So with their first investment into telecommunications, they're a renewable energy investment company, and they made they made investment in us last year of 145 million. So they're in essence, and even with the vouchers very rarely cover the cost of the full build. So it's our own capital anyway, and then we can claim some of it back. But the idea for us is, like, when we put down a footprint, we're looking at the bigger picture always. So where can we go next in terms of the footprint? So there's a bigger picture to each project almost. We see it as a footprint, but then an investment in an area that we can expand on in different directions as time comes. But it's a long game. There's a few years before we see a positive return from some of these areas. So it is our investors are bought into that kind of long game image, and that's the way that we're very much doing it. And it's quite an exciting journey to be on. Interesting.
About 30 years ago, there were about 100 cable companies in the UK.
Yeah.
Today, is hundreds of companies on fibre. Can you see in 10 years' time, there'll be one again on fibre?
I think there'll be... my personal view on the industry is there's going to be a level of consolidation coming at some point where it's going to happen. There's been a huge expansion, and I think there will be buyouts of different companies in the future. So I think that the number will come down. And
To one.
maybe,
Plus BT.
maybe. I like to think that there are some. I like to think that there will always be others, because it does keep there. It's good to have that competition, and I do think there is a good thing from having the service in cities and rural areas, having that alternative.
Hi, Reece.
Hiya.
How unique is this community engagement approach amongst altnets? And forgive the naivety of my question.
No, it's fine.
I'm 3 months into the role and new to the industry.
I think it's quite a new idea. I think there are a few that are trying it out and seeing how it goes. Naively, I'd like to think that we're at the forefront of kind of defining the community engagement, and we have seen a few other suppliers kind of try our different kind of strategies and techniques in terms of ways of engaging the community and things like that. But the way that we look at it is we go with the community with their full support behind us. And in many occasions, they've actually their first stage was not just to speak with Broadway, but to speak with a few others. And almost the nice thing about, going off on a tangent, nice thing about doing these projects for the first time is these communities have been trying with a big company for a very long time and got nowhere and been able to speak to nobody. And all of a sudden, I found this when I was at Powys County Council, they've got 2 altnets that want to talk to them. They want to talk to them and have that conversation about who they are and will connect your community. And each one has a different approach to doing that. And then the community make that decision. But yeah, so it is unique, and it is growing, and it is very kind of niche to rural areas, because market towns are a commercial investment anyway, so it's a different approach. So yeah, it's quite new, but I find it really rewarding. It's the perk of my job. It's the best bit, I think. Any other questions?
Are there any others? Oh, there must be some. Come on. I was thinking, as you're doing all of these weird things, what's the weirdest way you've had to get to somewhere?
Oh, wow. So I guess it's more back in our wireless days where we've had the most challenges. So on the Isle of Arran, so our first major project was connecting an island wirelessly, and we're now overbuilding that with fibre. And we've got 2 properties that are genuinely in the back of nowhere, and they are surrounded by forestry. You can barely see these properties, and they thought that they would never be able to connect them, but one of our surveyors was walking around the island and spotted the chimney of a property from an angle I thought, we can get a signal up there. So actually, by pure random chance, when we said, no, we can't connect them, just by spotting the chimney of a property from another part of the island, they were connected. So that's probably the most random story I've had, which is, but it worked, they're connected, they're happy. So yeah, that's probably the weirdest one, but there are some interesting challenges. You know, glacial landscapes chuck up a whole load of new challenges.
I could imagine. Are there any others? Then I think it's perfect time. We go and have some coffee and tea. Thanks very much, Reece.
Thank you, everybody.
Amazing.
Thank you so much.
Love your enthusiasm.
Can I do one thing? Because this is a big moment for me. Can I take a selfie with you all? Just for, what a sad thing to do, right?
There's copyright on this. You know that, Reece.
Yay, thank you.
Really well done.